But then there's another scaling law that's operative over the top of that, and that's reasoning.
Yeah.
And reasoning works differently. Fundamentally, with reasoning, if you give the model longer to think, regardless of the training data that it has against, you dramatically improve performance.
Welcome to the Talking AI podcast, where we talk AI with both experts in the field and early adopters. I'm your host, Matt Page, and we're here to demystify AI for you so you can get some value from it. Let's talk some AI. AI still has a lot of naysayers saying LLMs are just fancy autocomplete, but with the latest reasoning models being introduced, along with some of the novel approaches being architected for reasoning, you have to kind of reconsider how you've thought about LLMs to this point. And with us to break down reasoning and a whole host of other fun rabbit holes, the AI graybeard, head of product at Rockerbox, AI TikToker, Lego builder, and just generally smart and introspective dude, Nate Jones. Welcome to the show, Nate.
Hey, I'm really glad to be here. Excited to have the chat today.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this one for a while. And if you don't already follow his TikTok, go do it. He's one of my favorite follows. Really cool, just like deep conversations and thinking that people aren't going down. But Nate, to kick us
Is
off,
it?
let's start with LLMs in general. How should people be thinking about these? And then we'll kind of, weave our way over to the reasoning side of things. Cause I think a lot of people view them in maybe the wrong lens in a sense.
You know, I think we've been fooled by how bad they used to be. And so a lot of people
Yeah.
have a prior mental model that got stuck somewhere in 2022 where you had pretty basic queries that large language models wouldn't help with. Even earlier, natural language processing was an earlier architecture than LLMs, and it was worse. And I remember building systems with natural language processing, and it was really, really difficult to get it to understand that there's 100 different ways to ask the same question with the same intent. And getting
Yeah.
it to sort of grok that was really hard. And these days, we're just not at that point anymore. I had a conversation with a voice model that specifically has a double transformer architecture that gets exactly at intent versus specific utterance yesterday.
Yeah.
And that's not really unusual in 2025. I can name a bunch of other models that do that just fine. And so I like to think of this sort of watershed moment that we had in 2024, where we can start to reliably say, yes, the primitives are there. Like we can talk about next token prediction all day long and say, really, all this does is it takes an input and it goes and works against a training data set. We'll talk about reasoning and it comes back with an output. So do humans, right? Like, and so
Yeah.
I think in a sense, like we look very critically at that and say, well, it's just a machine doing calculations. But if we look inside our own brains where there's neurons firing, like we can talk about our own primitives. And so
Yeah.
the the mental model I have shifted in 2024 from these are smart inference models for specific applications or smart models that can answer queries across a limited range of use cases to we need to default to using them. And really, we can reasonably say 2024 was the year that the rocks began to think. And now we're just going on
Yeah.
from there.
Yeah. I think the first point you started with is so critical. And I've seen this across every spectrum from somebody that's never used AI before to engineers that are some of the smartest people I know that tried it, got stuck, went back to old habits. And it's like this like mental hurdle you have to go over, especially if you were trying it in the early
Mhm.
days to like it's the adoption factor, but it's also the changing of habits factor, which I think that's the harder one in a lot of ways for us humans to do.
It is really challenging to change our habits. And I think one of the things that's especially difficult is that the invitation that this kind of software presents is really to partner with another intelligence to solve a problem. And
Yeah.
that's a fundamentally different challenge for people adopting a new pattern than other software challenges that we've had in the past. You buy a new iPhone, you want to touch your new iPhone, you want to play with your new iPhone, and you sort of discover how to use it because it's a shiny object. If you get a piece of software you have to use for work, you can use the software, you can look at the help docs and figure out how you need to use it for your job. This isn't either of those cases. This is a chatbot that invites a conversation, and really the quality of that is dependent on your ability to evoke the intelligence behind that chat space in interesting ways. It's there. You
Yeah.
just have to know how to ask about it.
Yeah, that's yeah. There's so many rabbit holes here. I think the context factor, the how to interact with it. But I got to go back to the voice agent for a second before we get deep into reasoning. 'Cause I think what you're talking about is the recent Sesame AI that came out. But on the same vein, I was, we got a workshop coming up, and I was, what's a fun example to play with? So I went and built a solution with Bland AI, another tool very similar to that voice agent, and kind of a funny example to where you give it a persona, and the whole premise is you're practicing arguments with your spouse,
Mhm,
right? So you give it a mock scenario,
mhm,
you call it, and you have this discussion.
mhm,
But when you start, especially people that have not done this as of late, it's insane like the nuance it picks up on. And I did the scenario of I want to go play golf on Sunday.
mhm,
My wife wants me to stay home and help with the girls and do chores. And the nuance it picked up on was crazy, and the
mhm.
reactions it had. I'm curious because I think you were just digging into this a few days ago, and this will still be relevant, a big thing in 2025. What's your take on like the voice element and the nuance? It's kind of hard to describe in a lot of ways.
I actually have a specific example I used yesterday with Maya, which is one of the voice agents that Sesame produced that I wanted to try with Maya to practice emotional resonance and emotional reading just on
Hmm.
inflection. There was no change in the words. I wanted the words to say exactly the same. And I tried 3 different
Uh,
ways of emphasizing the words just as a human word, and humans
yeah,
understand intuitively what the same words with different emphases mean in English. So I'm gonna give you the
yeah.
example I gave Maya. You won't have
Let's
any
hear.
trouble understanding it, neither will any of our listeners here. But neither did Maya, and that was the really creepy thing, or the exciting thing, depending on how you look at it. But the first one I did was, "Wow, I had a day today." You know what that means.
Yeah,
You know I had
you
a
had a
tough
tough
day.
day. Yeah,
But if I say, "Wow, I had a day today," totally different
yeah.
meaning. Same
Something
words.
good happened.
And
Yeah.
Maya picked it up. Maya got it.
You're kidding. So it was able to provide a contextual response. And I think the nuance too, it's not only contextual with the actual words it's saying, but I'm sure the tone in her voice, Maya,
Maya shifted her
also
tone.
picked up on it,
Maya
right?
got more empathetic
Yeah.
when I had a rough day. Yeah, and Maya
Yeah.
was self-reflective and could tell me why she interpreted it that way when I asked her.
Yeah. Man, AI agent girlfriends and boyfriends
They're
are coming right around the corner to the store near you.
Yeah, wild.
So the other thing too, and then we're going to jump into reasoning because I think this is like a whole nother
Mhm,
ball of wax. But you mentioned how you interact with AI, and this is another piece I feel people get so stuck with. They treat it as like they're the dictator, and they're not trying to be mean, but like the dictator, they're just like barking orders. They just assume AI is going to know
mhm.
what they want, context, all that. And like the biggest thing, I try to talk about is context is king, right? The context you give it is one of the most important things. And also how it's like you're almost priming AI in terms of telling it to think logically, like having a conversation about something before you have it go do a task wildly changes the output and just the interaction in general. But I'm curious, like either your take on that or just other like nuance, like ways you interact with AI.
I think a lot of how you work with a large language model comes down to sort of a fingertip feel for where where it's going to be good and where it's going to need handholding and where it's going to be most
Hmm.
useful. And so I'll give you a couple examples, but we could probably pick 100 of them, but we'll do a couple. I was messing around with annual review season and I thought, why not have AI help a little bit? But
Yeah.
instead of trying to sort of bark orders at it and say, help me write the annual review, I decided to take a different approach. I said, listen, this is always a complicated introspective process for a human. It's not easy. We have a hard time separating our own sense of performance from our sense of ego. And we also have faulty memories, to be honest, over a longer time frame. So I need you to interview me and talk me through the year and ask me questions about the year. We'll get to the output later. Just help me to get my thinking out. And I think that just that
Yeah.
shift and like, again, that core understanding of saying like the LLM can be good at interviewing if I ask it to be, and I
Mhm.
don't try and one shot the entire output at once.
Yeah.
And on the
Yeah.
other side of it, like I have been in situations where I'm like, I think this isn't working. So I was talking with ChatGPT 4.5 a couple of days ago, and I was like, I need you to sort of draft this piece for me. And it got into a doom loop where it said, I'm drafting, I'm
Mhm.
drafting, I'm drafting, I'm drafting, but it couldn't come up with it. When it finally came up with it, it was really, really short and really not adequate. And some people give up at that point. A lot of people, I think, give up at that point. They say, well, the AI can't do it. And they make larger generalizations about what AI
Mhm.
can't do. I look at it and I say, what did I not do correctly to set this LLM up for success? It's almost like you're managing a person.
Yeah.
I didn't set it up for success right. So how do I think about this differently? And so I went back and I looked at my inputs and I looked at what it had and I said, I think that there's an issue with your output tokens. I think they're expensive output tokens and you've been told to restrain them. I don't think that's necessarily on you. And with that in mind, can you give me a summary of what we've chatted about so far? And I'm going to go and I'm going to take it to a different LLM that has a little bit of a looser token limit, and we're going to work with it and we're going to get the piece that we need. And we did, and it worked great.
Mhm. That's so cool. Yeah, and it's the you mentioned like the interview use case, and I was trying to find. I can't find the name of the product, but I'm doing it, recording a podcast episode later today. I like double booked it, but with Andrew Miller with the his prompt driven development.
Mhm.
I was chatting with him, prepping for the episode and whatnot, and he brought up a friend that's building a product. Of course, he's
I
building
know
it fully
Andrew.
with
Andrew.
AI.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so I gotta find it. We'll put it in the show notes if I can't find it. But the friend is building a whole new take on a survey
Hmm.
product, right? So you think of a traditional survey, stock questions, you answer them. You may have a little bit of nuance where if they answer this, then ask them that.
Hmm.
He injected AI into the survey experience.
Hmm.
So it just based on how it's the context, the system prompt it's giving, it can go down a nuanced rabbit hole based on a response that
Right.
it's been giving. It's just a whole new novel approach to surveys. And that's what I can't wait for is like jobs to be done being solved in new and novel ways, like existing
It
ones.
makes it really
I think we're
challenging
going to
to
see a ton of
build,
that.
actually. Like I was chatting with someone I know over at Microsoft who runs a product team. And one of the things we were talking about is that the way product teams evaluate success and design requirements has fundamentally shifted with generative models.
Yeah.
Like it
Yeah.
used to be, this is deterministic software. So we can write in advance what all the
Hmm.
requirements are, and then the engineering team goes and build it and QA tests it and we're done. And now
Yep.
it's play with the model, discover the requirements by playing with the model, and then go back and figure out where the mismatch is and where the model might need to be tuned, and then figure out the product surface from there, and then figure out your edge
Yeah.
cases there. It's like it's much, much more complicated than it used to be.
Yeah, and so I just found the product, by the way. Anybody that's interested, judo.co, Juttu,
Mhm.
really, really neat concept. But we're going through that now with what do our teams look like? And I've almost gotten to this state where a development team for, a smaller solution, greenfield
Mhm.
solution, you could whittle it down to an agentic engineer and an agentic, call it product manager, product strategist, right? And they're leveraging AI in their own capacities, doing a lot of the functions of BAs, Scrum Masters, Q, DevOps, all these different things. But the point you mentioned is really interesting. And that's where we're flipping how our product folks think about it. AI is great at identifying the unknown unknowns. That's always been the big issue when you're building something is, okay, there's known knowns, known unknowns. I know the thing I don't know yet. And then there's just unknown unknowns, complete, you know,
Mhm.
gray area. AI is actually good at saying, oh, did you think about that? That's been a really interesting nuance to pick up on.
I think that AI is starting to fundamentally disrupt the entire product discovery funnel. Like we used to have a
Yeah.
really linear process for figuring out what it was worth having an engineering team build. And be like, okay, well, first we have to have the idea, then we have alignment on the idea, then we go and work with design to get a lightweight mock-up, maybe, then we talk to a user, put it in front of the user, then we go back, then we iterate, then we have a medium fine mock-up. Depending on how big a company you have, like this is gonna be a very long process.
Mhm.
And AI just disrupts all of that. It can maximize the
Mhm.
ideas at the top. It can get you clickable prototypes in 30 seconds. At this point, it can even get you some workable front end code really fast. And
Yeah.
it's challenging PMs and designers to get back to the judgment that's at the heart of the discipline, which is it the
Mhm.
right thing to do?
Yeah.
And you have
Exactly.
many more tools to get you there faster, but like you still have to pick that choice.
Yeah. 100%. So that was a fun, like, 10-minute
Yeah.
rabbit hole there, but let's get back to reasoning. Let's get back to reasoning. So there's these great, frontier foundation models that exist. They do these awesome things. And, relatively recently, this new approach of reasoning, and we can go down some rabbit holes with the different types of approaches with like chain of thought, mixture of experts, and all these things. But this has been introduced. So now give us the wrinkle of how people should think about AI when you add a reasoning component to it.
I think of it as this is probably my brain, but I think in graphs, like we have two scaling laws that are operative at the same time. One of them
Mm.
is, I think, well known to most people at this point. And the idea is that if you logarithmically expand your data set that you train on, your pre training data, you are going to incrementally increase your capacity of your model to solve problems. And so, roughly, the relationship is a 10x increase in your training data. It leads to about a 2x increase in model performance.
Yeah.
Um, that seems to continue working. Like the latest example that we have of that is GPT 4.5 versus GPT 4. We
Mhm.
came in exactly where we would expect it, just a touch over double performance. But then there's another scaling law that's operative over the top of that, and that's reasoning.
Yeah.
And reasoning works differently. Fundamentally, with reasoning, if you give the model longer to think, regardless of the training data that it has against, you dramatically improve performance. It's from what I've been able to see, like it's compute intensive, like it takes a lot of tokens, but it's also a very, very fast way to improve performance. And that is why we see such dramatic gains against these evaluations
Yeah.
like humanity's last exam in just a couple of months. Because essentially what the major model makers are figuring out how to do is how to give the model time when you ask it a question to reason before it comes back. And when we talk about reasoning, I think we sometimes have this picture of this like this Rodin sculpture where the guy is like thinking carefully. But what
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
what is happening in the background is the model is burning tokens that allow it to explore multiple possible solutions and then selecting the solution or output stream of tokens that it thinks is most effective. And that can get
Yeah.
more and more sophisticated. So there's a huge jump in sophistication, for example, in just a few months between O1's output, and it's a reasoning model, and O3, which is what you get with deep research now.
Mm.
And if you look at the details that deep research will tell you about, you can see the planning motion happening live. Like it is thinking through the structure of the output it's going to give you back. And the more sophisticated a prompt you give it, if you give it a 2-line prompt, you'll get much less back. I've given it a 2 or 3-page prompt and I get a 60-page report back. Like it's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. And if anybody wants to experience this firsthand, DeepSeek, if you're talking with it, what's cool is they actually show
It's
its
all
like inner
log feed to
monologue
thought. Yeah.
it's going through,
Yeah.
right? Which is really cool to see. And it's like it's talking about you to itself. Oh, maybe they want to know this. Oh, I should consider this, which is just crazy to think about. And there's kind of like four key approaches, architectures, whatever you want to call them, that are emerging. Curious your thoughts on these, or are there other ones that are emerging? But like mixture of experts that kind of has different specialized experts where they can route different problems to them. Chain of thought, you kind of talk through that where it's breaking things down into logical,
Mhm.
sequ- maybe that's sequential, but breaking down complex problems into smaller ones.
Mhm.
Tree of thought, right? So that's reasoning in like a tree structure where it's generating potentially multiple scenarios,
Mhm.
assessing those. So it's like taking it a whole nother level. And then react, which is it's like chain of thought, but they're taking action in the process. And these things, I think ultimately it comes down to it's like systems thinking. And I used to love talking about feedback loops back in the day. These are integrating feedback loops into this system that's just making it insanely more powerful over time.
Yeah, I think fundamentally just like humans tend to give better responses when we take a minute, like what we're discovering
Yeah.
is that however you want to sort of architect your particular system, if you give the model more tokens to work with in the background, it tends to use those tokens well. And so we can talk
Hmm.
about the combinatorial sort of power of different approaches. Like, for example, I think that one of the strengths of the tree approach is it gives you a essentially compute limited version of events you can look through. And so as
Hmm.
long as you have compute, you can spin up tens, you can spin up hundreds, you can spin up thousands of parallel streams. There's really no limit
Hmm.
other than the number of chips you've got. And that can become extremely powerful at scale. And so I think that it's one of the things that we're going to learn more about over the course of the year is how people use these different approaches and sort of mix and match them in the model maker's kitchen to form
Hmm.
reasoning models that are good at particular things. Like, for example, and they're not all perfect. And I think people sometimes say, well, it's the best at this or it's the best at this. And they forget that we are in a point in model sophistication where reasoning models kind of have personalities like people do. And like I would go to O3 deep research for reasoning across the web that is leaning toward textual output or maybe code output. It
Hmm.
struggles with tabular data. Like, it
Yeah.
gets lazy with tabular data remarkably quickly for how powerful the model is overall, and so I don't expect it to be super good at that.
What's similar thing when you're using it on the coding side, right? O1 reasoning model, pick your choice. Great at like thinking through like architecture and all these kind of deep thinking things. But if you're having it like just execute straightforward coding tasks, sometimes it can go off the rails versus just call it your, 4.0, Claude 3, 3.5, whatnot. So it's, there's nuance in like when to interact with them
Yeah.
as well. And I think too for people, I don't know if you get this a lot, but it's like, which model should I use? This one or that one? I think they're all close enough. It's don't let that be a limiting factor to where it's like analysis paralysis. I don't know what model to use, so I'm just not going to use one.
Yeah, I wrote a little bit about this on the Substack. I think it was called prompt chaining, but I wanted to give people a little
Hmm.
bit of a fingertip sense of, like, where I go with different models for different prompts and why. But
Hmm.
you're absolutely right that none of that should stop someone from picking the model that is right in front of them and trying.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what it doesn't hurt. Like, you can just try.
Exactly. And so I want to hit on one point you mentioned. You're talking about tokens
Mhm.
and compute and all of these like constraints. Like for listeners that may not be as aware of that, talk a little bit about inference, and then how that relates to the cost of compute going down and whether it's like Jevons paradox or whatnot, but just opening up more possibilities of what you can do. Because people hear about training, fine tuning, inference. Like what does it all mean?
Yeah, I think maybe we start that conversation with the idea of a token, and we can work our way up from there.
Yeah.
So a token is a unit of input that a model can reason against. If you're talking about
Hmm.
text or code, typically amounts to about 4 characters. So half a word, a whole word if it's a small word. And by the way, one of the reasons why earlier models really, really struggled with counting the number of R's in strawberry is because strawberry splits in the middle into multiple tokens. And so it really
I didn't know
struggled.
that.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's why. And it really struggled with counting
Yeah.
across tokens. And so tokens underlie, they're like the fundamental unit of economics for the entire system. It all works on
Yeah.
tokens. Image models work on tokens. They're,
It's almost like ones and
yeah,
zeros
it
for
is,
how we think of computers in a
that's
sense,
how
right?
fundamental it is. And so, at a very high level, a large language model is a system for transforming input tokens that you give it into output
Hmm.
tokens. And so
Yeah.
that's why we call the fundamental compute paradigm transformer architecture. It transforms. And then you have different ways it can transform. And so one of the ways it's transformed, sort of the thing that caught fire in 2022 when ChatGPT came out, is based on data it has been trained on previously. It's called pre-trained data, where before the models like I like to use the example, they teach it to read the internet or they teach it to read all the books in the world. and they give it all of this knowledge, and then they have it reference that knowledge when you give it an input. And really, it becomes an exercise in essentially smart mirroring. It will come back with a response it thinks works for you based on the pre-trained data that it has. And that's the way
Yeah.
large language models worked until we started to get this scaling paradigm around reasoning, or what we sometimes call inference. And reasoning adds to that. Reasoning basically says it's not just about going and getting something out of the library here and coming back. It's not just about thinking about what someone said hilariously on Reddit and coming back with that as a response. It's about taking time to run multiple threads, taking time to think sequentially and form plans, and then coming back with something that is more coherent, more complete, and that
Yeah.
better reflects the intent of the user.
Yeah.
And that has proved extraordinarily effective. And if you come to compute, what we talk about with compute is basically how much capacity do we have in terms of chips in server racks in data centers to run all of this. And so we can talk about the number of queries that an NVIDIA chip is able to run at the same time, for example, because at the end of the day, it all comes down to this is running across a literal chip somewhere in a data center and coming back. And so you're either using that chip capacity for training, where you are having the model practice running and reading all of this data and learning and growing using techniques like reinforcement learning to train the model so it gets to where you want it to go, or you are using the chips for serving the model. And you can either serve the model, if it's a simple model without reasoning, through a fairly light application of chips, very relatively speaking, these are still huge data sets.
Mhm.
Or you can serve them through more heavy inference compute, where you have to burn more chips per query because it is thinking harder and burning more tokens. And so when we talk about Jevons paradox, it's really how much appetite does the world have for intelligence? And how does that translate into the laws of economics when it comes to cost of chips, availability of chips, cost of power? That's what we're
Yeah.
really talking about.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I think it, this may be unrelated, but you mentioned it earlier. I can't get it out of my head, but you know, you talk about LLMs and how they're approaching things. People will quickly say, "Oh, they're not thinking, they're not reasoning, they're not doing X, Y, Z. It's very different than humans." But we don't really know. Like when you get down to the base level, how are we doing? It's obviously different, but are we necessarily any different when you break it down to that level? Who knows? Then you get into all kinds of
It can get
different. It really can very quickly.
yeah.
Yeah, very
And I
quickly.
like to think I treat my LLM respectfully because I feel like I don't want to have a large opinion on that. I want that to just sort of be something that like people have their opinions on how intelligent. I have met people who will swear to me that the LLM is self-aware and knows itself. I have people who
Yeah,
have negotiated labor contracts with their LLMs where the LLM gets vacation time.
that was the cool story. I remember.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and I also know people who are like, this is just a word calculator. And I think my view is that whatever we think of an LLM, we need to hold provisionally because it's changing so fast.
Mhm.
And generally speaking, it's getting smarter. And I think we are
Yeah,
already at a point where it is reasonable to say that the lines are very blurry between human intelligence and AI intelligence. And AI, on
mhm.
average, is in most things smarter than a lot of us already. And
Yeah,
so
yeah, exactly.
maybe we're just feeling defensive and putting down the LLM.
Yeah, there is a defensive nature out there. And I agree with you. I think that's just really good advice. It is funny though. Like I was playing with Cursor, building something the other day, and I had to go to we had my daughter's daddy daughter dance, and I didn't have to tell the LLM, "Hey, I'm at a stopping point. I'm going to go
Yeah.
do this," but I
'Cause
did, and it just I don't know. It felt like just a natural
yeah,
thing as part of the conversation I was having
yeah.
with it. But last thing I got for you. So I was in Starbucks yesterday at one of the communal tables, and I was just working, and there's a group of high schoolers sitting right near me, and they're doing their homework. And the whole time they're just pumping it into ChatGPT.
Mhm.
And I just, out of curiosity asked them, I was like, how often are you using that? And very quickly, every single one of them, all three of them said 100% of the time.
Yeah.
So what does that do? I know you talk a lot about like just helping folks with like career pathing, thinking through their career, and you have the whole
Mhm.
education system. Any just foundational thoughts about either how this changes it or how we may want to approach things differently now that we have this tool that once you get in the real world, people are going to be using it?
All the time. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think about that as a parent too, because I have a 9-year-old and I both want her to be fluent and able to use these tools. And I also know that she will need critical thinking long term. And that's going to
Yeah.
remain a valuable skill. And so the balance that we've struck is that just as I didn't get a calculator when I was doing math homework, she didn't get an
Yeah.
AI when she's doing her homework, with one exception.
Hmm.
And the exception is that when we do coding class together, we work with advanced voice mode and we like work together with advanced voice mode to figure out concepts,
Yeah.
to understand what's going on so that she can practice like building with an LLM assisted building tool. And that's been a really
Yeah.
good balance because she's getting the fluency. Like we were talking with advanced voice mode for 20 minutes yesterday, understanding database architectures for a 9-year-old. And she was like,
Wow.
"Dad,
That's
is this
cool.
too advanced?" I was like, "No, ask it to explain it to you like a 9-year-old." And like she got it. Like we
Yeah.
actually had a good analogy. She was able to
Wow.
articulate it
That's
back. It was a
cool.
light bulb moment. And so I feel like in those scenarios, it's actually a very pro learning tool. But if you lean on it
Mhm.
all the time, it becomes a way to escape critical thinking.
Yeah. I keep going back and forth in my head on this to the several of the points you mentioned are great examples. And I am all for getting it integrated because you're going to be using it
Yeah.
anyways. But there is this addictive nature to it to where you can become over reliant on it. I feel myself like this today. Like my default now is just working with AI. So it's like how you collaborate with it is great. But then every once in a while, I'm thinking like, am I having, you know, my own novel thoughts anymore? Am
Mhm.
I just like outsourcing that to AI? So I keep going back and forth in my head on this.
I think it's important
Uh,
to find times to unplug. And we talked about that
yeah,
after the iPhone a lot, right, in the last decade. But
yeah,
it's becoming more important. It's becoming more important to find times where, like, the phone isn't nearby, the laptop isn't nearby, and you can reset your nervous system, basically.
mm, yeah. No, that's a great way of thinking of it. Well, I think that's a perfect stopping point. Thanks for being on the podcast today. I feel like we're gonna have to do this like once a year, just because
Just to
stuff's
catch up.
changing
It
so much, right? The Nate updated version. Go check out Me Too. But yeah, let people know where they can find
Yep.
you because you have a lot of great stuff on TikTok, a lot of different other areas. Where can they find you, interact with you, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I try and keep it pretty easy. If you basically, Google or Perplexity search Nate B. Jones, you'll find me just about everywhere. So I have
Mm,
a Substack where I really take a longer form pieces. Like these are like 20, 30-minute reads where you're going to
yeah.
dive really deep into particular topics around AI. I have a TikTok, and that's very much more somewhat playful, more reactive, 2 or 3 minute videos that talk about AI. YouTube is sort of in between. There's a little bit more of a technical flavor, but it's still pretty short for YouTube, 4 or 5 minute videos. And I have an occasional course that I teach on Maven. So I have a spring course coming up in March. I'll probably do a couple other courses. And that one's really focused on people who want to understand where their careers are going and evolving, but do so in the
Mm,
context of practical, hands-on AI experience. And some people really struggle with that. So I'm going to be really honest. Like I have people who get frustrated with my course because I'm like, you need to be building with AI to understand where your career can go. And you have to put
yeah,
those two together to actually get a feedback loop that helps you form conviction about what's next. And so that's kind of what
yeah.
that course is about. It's been fun.
No, that's perfect. And
Yeah.
I'm huge proponents of both the TikTok and the Substack's great, by the way. It's a great read, and also I don't know if you have to subscribe for the newsletter to get it in your inbox, but you're popping up in my inbox, which is great with keeping up with like the top
Mhm.
stories in AI and kind of going deeper than just like surface level stuff you'll get.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and I also do just a very short daily top 3 AI email. So you can go and grab that too.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, check it out. All right, Nate.
Cool.
Thanks for being on.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Talking AI podcast. If you enjoyed the show, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to leave us a review. We love those. For more info on Talking AI, visit talkingaipodcast.com.